The roof caved in on a Tuesday, and Chester Rhodes was standing right there when it happened. Not the actual roof, though that would come later, water pouring through split shingles like the sky itself had decided Edith Shelton had suffered enough and needed to be reminded otherwise. No, what caved in that Tuesday morning was something far more dangerous than timber and tar paper. It was the wall Chester had spent 11 years building around every soft and breakable part of himself, and the thing that broke it was a boy, no more than 7 years old, standing barefoot in the mud with a split lip and tears cutting clean lines through the dirt on his face, holding out a mason jar with 3 pennies inside. "Mama says we can't pay you till harvest," the boy said. His voice did not shake. His chin did not tremble. He had the eyes of someone who had already decided that life was going to be difficult, and that deciding to cry about it was a luxury he couldn't afford. "But she says, if you'll fix the roof anyway, she'll feed you supper every night for as long as it takes." Chester sat on his horse and looked at that jar for a long moment. He looked at the pennies. He looked at the boy. Behind the boy, at the edge of the porch that sagged on its east side like a man leaning away from bad news, 2 more boys stood watching him. The older one, maybe 10, had his arms crossed and his jaw set in an expression of practiced suspicion that Chester recognized immediately, because he had worn that same expression himself since approximately age 12. The youngest, barely 4 years old, was clutching the older one's sleeve and peering around him with enormous dark eyes that asked nothing and feared everything. And it was in that exact moment, with mud on his boots and nowhere particular to be, and 11 years of running behind him like a debt he couldn't settle, that Chester Rhodes made the single decision that would either save him or destroy him completely. He took off his hat. He had not taken his hat off for a woman in 6 years, but he was getting ahead of himself. The story of how Chester Rhodes ended up sitting on a horse in front of Edith Shelton's failing homestead began, as most disasters do, with a smaller disaster a week earlier. Chester had been riding west out of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1883, which was the kind of year where the grasshoppers had been generous, and the rain had been stingy, and half the farmers in the county were one bad month away from packing their entire lives into a wagon and heading somewhere that promised better. He had been riding for no reason he could name honestly. He had a small amount of money from 3 weeks of fence work outside Wichita, enough for ammunition and dried beef and the occasional night in a real bed. And he had the kind of restlessness in his chest that he had learned by now could not be outrun on horseback, but that he kept trying to outrun anyway. Chester Rhodes was 32 years old. He had been a cowhand, a fence builder, a cattle driver, a stable hand, a freighter, a deputy in a town he no longer spoke the name of, and briefly and humiliatingly a gambler in Dodge City, where he had lost $40 and a perfectly good pocket watch in a single evening, before deciding that gambling was a talent God had not distributed to him. He had been born in Missouri in 1851, the second of 4 children, and he had left home at 17 with $2, a bedroll, and a conviction that the world was a wide and various place that owed him a look. The world had been wide and various, all right. It had not owed him particularly. He carried no dark secret, no forbidden past, no criminal betrayal. That was the strange part, the part he could not explain even to himself. Other drifters he'd met on the road seemed to have a reason for the drifting, a woman who'd broken them, a crime they were hiding from, a debt that kept them moving. Chester had none of those things. He had simply discovered, sometime in his mid-20s, that he was very good at leaving and very poor at staying, and that every time he approached something that felt like it might be permanent, a cold and unreasoning panic moved through him like winter through an uninsulated wall, and he rode away before the feeling could root itself. He had never examined this tendency closely. Examining things closely was another talent God had apparently distributed to other people. He was 4 miles east of a small settlement called Haverford Crossing, Kansas, riding the main wagon road with no particular plan, when his horse threw a shoe on a stretch of rocky ground, and he had to walk the animal the rest of the way into town. Haverford Crossing was not a town by any ambitious definition of the word. It had a general store that doubled as a post office, a livery stable, a church, a saloon with a broken front window that had been boarded up with a flour sack for what looked like at least 2 seasons, and a scattering of homesteads pushing out from the main road in every direction like the spokes of a wheel that had survived rough terrain by shedding most of its parts. The man at the livery, a square-built German immigrant named Metzger who spoke English with the careful precision of someone who had learned it from a dictionary, told Chester that the nearest blacksmith was 12 miles north, but that there was work available locally if a man was willing. Chester, who was down to his last $14 and did not feel like riding 12 miles on a lame horse, asked what kind of work. Metzger told him there was a widow woman out on the Shelton property, 2 miles south of town, whose husband had died of fever the previous spring. The roof of her main house was leaking in 3 places and the porch supports were rotting through and her well casing had cracked and needed relining, and she had 3 boys and 40 acres and no help and no money and a disposition, Metzger added with a particular expression that made most of the men in the county reluctant to approach her with anything as complicated as charity. "Why reluctant?" Chester asked. Metzger smiled slightly. "Because she is a woman who knows exactly what she is owed and exactly what she is not owed, and she will tell you which is which without being asked." Chester thought about that for a moment. "What's her name?" "Edith Shelton. And her husband, Thomas Shelton, good man. Fever took him fast March right before planting. She planted the field herself with the oldest boy helping, made a fair crop of it too." Metzger paused. "She does not need a man to tell her what to do. She needs a man who can swing a hammer and keep his opinions to himself." Chester had the distinct impression that Metzger was describing the difficulty precisely because he wanted to see whether it would be a difficulty for Chester specifically. He decided to ignore this. "I can swing a hammer," Chester said. "Can you keep your opinions to himself?" Chester thought about this more honestly than he usually thought about anything. "I can try," he said, which was probably the most truthful thing he'd said to anyone in months. He went to the Shelton property that afternoon to introduce himself and ask about the work, and that was when the boy appeared on the porch with the mason jar of pennies, and Chester took off his hat, and everything he had spent 11 years constructing about himself began to fail at the joints. Edith Shelton came out of the house behind the boy before Chester could say a word. She was 30 years old, though she had the self-possession of someone decades older, and she was not what Chester had been picturing, though he could not have said what exactly he had been picturing. She was of medium height, slender in a way that spoke of work rather than of delicacy, with brown hair that she wore pinned back practically and brown eyes that assessed him from the doorway with the quick efficiency of someone who had learned to read people fast, because slow reading was a luxury that got you hurt. She was not beautiful in the way that poets spent time on. She was beautiful in the way that a well-made thing is beautiful, in the way a good knife or a strong rope is beautiful, in the way of something that has been tested by use and has not broken. She looked at him, and then at the mason jar in her youngest boy's hands, and then back at him. "Caleb," she said to the boy, "I told you to wait for me." "You were cooking," the boy said, which was apparently the entirety of his defense. Edith came down the steps and stood a few feet from Chester's horse. She did not look up at him the way some people looked up at someone on horseback with any particular deference. She looked at him straight as though the horse were an irrelevance. "You're the man Metzger sent," she said. It was not quite a question. "I didn't know he'd sent me," Chester said. "I thought I was coming on my own." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the near cousin of a smile, a thing that acknowledged the existence of something that might have been funny under slightly different circumstances. "Metzger sends everyone," she said. "He thinks I need managing." "He told me you were the opposite of manageable," Chester said, "and that I'd need to keep my opinions to myself." This time it was closer to a smile, only by a small margin. "He's half right," she said. "I don't need managing, but I don't need opinions either. I need someone who can fix a roof and patch a porch and reline a well casing without making me feel like I should be grateful in the wrong kind of way." Chester looked at her for a moment. "I'm Chester Rhodes," he said. "I'm good with a hammer and I don't have opinions about things that aren't my business. My horse threw a shoe this morning, so I'm here for at least a few days regardless. I can work for room and board if you've got room." "I have a barn," she said. "Barn's fine." She studied him with that quick, precise assessment for another moment. "The roof leaks in 3 spots. The east porch post is about to give. The well casing cracked over winter. There's also a gate on the north pasture that the older 2 boys have fixed 4 times, and it keeps failing because they're fixing the symptom and not the problem. I can show you what needs doing." "All right," Chester said. "All right," she said, and turned back toward the house. And that was the entirety of their first conversation, which was also the entirety of the job interview. And Chester dismounted, tied his horse at the post, and followed her around the property while she showed him the problems in the same calm, methodical way she would have shown anyone, without apology for the scope of them, and without any detectable desperation, though he was already beginning to understand that the desperation was there, buried under about 6 inches of necessary competence, and that it was his business to ignore it. The 3 boys, he learned by the end of that first afternoon, were named Caleb, who was 7 and apparently fearless, and had his mother's brown eyes and his father's stubbornness, according to Edith, in that combination which was both his greatest strength and everyone's greatest challenge. Henry, who was 10 and suspicious of everything and carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who had recently been required to grow up faster than he'd planned. And the youngest, named Will, who was 4 and had not spoken a single word to Chester, but had followed him at a distance of exactly 8 feet for 3 hours, watching everything he did with those enormous dark eyes. Chester fixed the north pasture gate that first afternoon, found the actual failure point in the hinge mounting, replaced the wood at the post base that had been slowly rotting from the inside where no one could see it, and had the gate swinging clean and true before the light went. Henry watched this from 10 feet away with his arms still crossed. "You knew where to look," he said finally. It was the first thing he had said to Chester. "Your mother said you'd been fixing it 4 times, Chester said. 4 times tells you the obvious fix isn't working, so you look past the obvious." Henry thought about this. "Father used to say something like that," he said, and then something shifted in his face and he walked away, and Chester did not follow him, which was the right decision. He slept in the barn that night on clean hay and listened to the wind come through the gaps in the boards and felt, for reasons he could not immediately explain, less restless than he had felt in longer than he could easily remember. The work on the roof began the next morning. Chester assessed the damage in the first hour and understood that it was both worse and better than it looked. Worse because the sheathing under the shingles in 2 of the 3 leak spots had rotted through and would need to be replaced, not just patched. Better because the underlying structure, the rafters and the ridge beam, were sound. Thomas Shelton had built this house to last and had done it right, and that fact was both a comfort and a quiet pain because it told Chester something about the kind of man Thomas Shelton had been. Edith brought him coffee in the mid-morning. She did not linger. She handed him the mug, said the general store in town had the lumber he'd need on account if he presented himself to Mr. Ferris, and mentioned the Shelton property, and then she went back inside, and Chester heard her begin whatever needed doing next in the ongoing and apparently inexhaustible catalog of things that needed doing. He went to town for lumber. Metzger was outside the livery when Chester rode past and gave him a look that was entirely too knowing for a man who allegedly knew nothing about the situation. Chester ignored this also. He spent the next 4 days on the roof. It was good work, the kind of physical, purposeful labor that had always suited him better than thinking, and he fell into the rhythm of it with something that felt uncomfortably like peace. The boys moved around him in their separate orbits. Caleb began climbing up to hand him things on the second day, which Chester allowed because the boy's nerve was extraordinary, and because refusing to acknowledge extraordinary nerve seemed like a harm. Henry watched with decreasing suspicion from the ground, and on the third day handed Chester a tool without being asked, which Chester accepted without comment. Will continued his 8-foot surveillance operation with great dedication. On the fourth afternoon, Edith came out to check the progress and stood below him looking up at the patched sections with the same appraising intelligence she applied to everything. "You do good work," she said. Not as a compliment precisely, as a statement of observed fact. "Thank you," he said. "Thomas was a good builder," she said. "He built this house to last." "I noticed," Chester said. There was a silence, not an uncomfortable silence. The particular kind of silence that exists between two people who are both comfortable with silence and who recognize that quality in each other. "How long have you been drifting?" she asked. The question did not feel intrusive in the way it would have from another person. It felt like the same clean, direct, practical approach she brought to everything, like checking the soundness of a beam before trusting weight to it. 11 years, Chester said. "Do you miss having a place?" He thought about this honestly, which was becoming a habit around her. "I don't know," he said. "I don't think I ever had a place to miss." She looked at him for a moment. "That's the saddest thing I've heard in a while," she said, and went back inside, and Chester sat on the roof with his hammer in his hand and felt something large and slow move through his chest like a river changing course. The rains came on the 5th day, not the gentle kind. The serious October kind. The kind that had been building in the western sky for 2 days and arrived with conviction. Chester had the worst of the roof sealed, but there was still one section on the north side that he hadn't got to yet, and at 2 in the morning he heard it, rain hitting the inside of the house at the pitch that meant it was coming through. He was out of the barn and onto the roof in his work clothes with a sheet of tar paper and a hammer before he had fully woken up, and he was halfway through nailing the temporary patch in the rain and the dark when the lantern appeared below him, held by Edith, who had come out of the house and was standing in the downpour holding the light up so he could see what he was doing, soaked to the skin in her dressing gown with her hair down for the first time since he'd been here. Looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read in the moving light, he finished the patch. It held. The rain continued. He climbed down and they stood on the covered section of the porch looking out at the rain together, both of them wet, neither of them saying anything for a long time. "You didn't have to do that in the middle of the night," she said finally. "It would have been worse by morning," he said. She turned and looked at him directly. In the lamplight and the rain, with her hair down and her composure temporarily stripped back by the honest emergency of the moment, she looked younger and more frightened than she ever let herself look during the day, and something about that vulnerability, that brief window into what she was actually carrying, hit Chester somewhere below his defenses. "Mr. Rhodes," she said. "Chester," he said. "Chester." She said his name carefully like she was deciding whether to set it down somewhere permanent. "Why are you still here? And I mean that genuinely. Metzger has found men to help me before. They always find a reason to be gone within 2 or 3 days. What's keeping you?" The honest answer was that he didn't know. The honest answer was that something about this place, these boys, this woman with her systematic courage and her 6 inches of competence over her despair, had gotten past the cold panic that usually drove him away from anything permanent, and he didn't understand how, and the not understanding frightened him considerably. "I haven't finished the well casing," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she went inside, and Chester sat down in the porch chair and listened to the rain on the repaired roof, and it did not leak, and he felt something settle in him like a foundation finding solid ground. The next day the boys were different with him, even Henry. It had gotten around that Chester had gone onto the roof in the middle of a rainstorm to keep the house dry, and apparently this had moved something in Henry's carefully maintained suspicion, because at breakfast he sat down next to Chester at the table without his arms crossed and said, I want to learn how to do the roofing properly." "We can do that," Chester said. "Father was going to teach me," Henry said. Just that. Just the one sentence carrying the whole weight of everything it meant. Chester looked at the boy for a moment. "Then we'll do it in a way he'd have approved of," Chester said. "No shortcuts." Henry nodded once. It was a very adult nod. Chester thought about how old this boy was and how old he had been made to feel, and felt a slow anger at the general unfairness of certain things. Not at anyone in particular, just at the category of things that took fathers before their sons were finished needing them. Edith was across the table pretending to be focused on Caleb's spilled milk. Chester noticed that she was not actually looking at the milk. He started teaching Henry the right way to assess structural damage that morning, and by afternoon the boy had the vocabulary of it and the logic of it, and was asking questions that were sharper than Chester had expected, which was probably because sharp thinking ran in this family and Henry had simply been waiting for the right subject to display it on. Caleb, meanwhile, had decided that Chester was his personal project. He followed Chester's every move with the unself-conscious adoration of a 7-year-old boy who had been without a male figure in his orbit for 7 months, and this adoration was both warming and painful for Chester to receive, because he knew he was supposed to leave. He always left, and Caleb did not yet understand that people left. Will, at the end of the first week, spoke to Chester for the first time. Chester was sitting on the porch steps in the evening, carving a small horse out of a piece of soft pine, the way he had taught himself to do during long cattle drives when the nights were empty. He heard the small feet approach and stop behind him, and then, very carefully, a small body settled onto the step beside him, not touching him but close. Chester kept carving. After a long time, Will said, "What's that?" "A horse," Chester said. Will considered this. "Like your horse." "I'm making it look like my horse," Chester said. "He's gray, so I'll paint it gray if your mama has any paint." "Mama has white paint," Will said, "for the porch." "Gray's just white mixed with something darker," Chester said. Will thought about this with the focused intensity that 4-year-olds bring to new information about the world. Then he said, "Can I have it?" "When it's done," Chester said. Will settled more firmly onto the step. He did not exactly lean against Chester, but the distance between them narrowed to a 1/4 inch, which was Will Shelton's way of indicating trust. Chester was beginning to understand, because the boy expressed everything in distances. Inside the house, through the window, Chester could hear Edith reading to Caleb, her voice steady and low, and the sound of it in the evening quiet did something to the inside of his chest that he did not have vocabulary for, but that he suspected was dangerous. That night, lying in the barn, Chester had the honest conversation with himself that he had been avoiding for a week. He was in trouble. That was the plain summary of it. He was in the specific kind of trouble that had always panicked him before, the kind where leaving would cause damage, where there were people whose days had started to organize themselves around his presence, and where his own interior weather had shifted in a way that could not be entirely shifted back. He had been telling himself that he would finish the well casing and ride on, but the well casing was going to take 2 more days, and in 2 more days something would need fixing or building or mending, because that was the nature of a homestead with 40 acres and 3 boys and no one with a hammer. He thought about Edith standing in the rain holding the lantern up for him. He thought about Henry asking to learn without his arms crossed. He thought about Will and the 3 pennies. He thought about Thomas Shelton, who had built his house to last and then gone and died in March and left it to slowly fail. He did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, Edith was in the kitchen when he came in for coffee, and she looked at him with that quick assessment and said, "You didn't sleep." "No," he admitted. She poured the coffee and set it in front of him and sat down across the table and looked at him with the directness that was simply her native mode of being in the world. "I need to say something," she said. "All right," he said. "The boys are getting attached to you," she said. "Caleb especially. Well, spoke to you before he spoke to our neighbor Mrs. Haverson, who has been bringing food every week since Thomas died, and she is a very kind woman. Henry asked you to teach him something, and Henry has not asked anyone for anything since March." Chester waited. "I am not telling you to leave," she said. "I'm telling you that if you're going to leave, I need enough time to prepare them for it, because I will not watch my boys suffer another loss without being able to tell them it's coming." The word loss landed on Chester like a beam falling. "What are you asking me?" he said carefully. "I'm asking what your intentions are," she said, with the same plain practicality she used for everything. But underneath it, underneath the 6 inches of competence, he could hear the thing that caused her to ask, because Edith Shelton was not a woman who asked for things. She was a woman who managed with what she had, and asking this had required something of her. "I don't know," Chester said, and then stopped himself because that was the coward's answer and she deserved better. "That's not true. I know that I don't want to leave. I know that every time I think about riding out of here, I feel the same thing I usually feel when I think about staying somewhere, which is fear, but in reverse. I'm afraid to go instead of afraid to stay, and I don't know what to do with that." Edith looked at him for a long time. "That's an honest answer," she said. "I'm trying," he said. She stood up and picked up her coffee and went to the window and looked out at the morning. The light was good that morning, the particular gold of Kansas October, and it fell across her in a way that Chester watched and did not look away from. "Thomas died very fast," she said. "He was well on Sunday and gone by Wednesday. There was no time to prepare. There was no time for anything except being there and then not being there." She paused. "I have been angry about that for 7 months. I have been angry at the fever, and I have been angry at the distance to the doctor, and I have been angry at Thomas for not building up the strength he needed last winter, which is not fair, and I know it's not fair, but it is the truth of what I have been feeling." She turned from the window. "I tell you this because I think you deserve to know that I am not a simple situation. I have 3 boys and a leaking roof and a grief that is not finished and an anger that is not finished and a stubbornness that is finished, completely finished, because that one's permanent." Chester found himself smiling, which surprised him. "I noticed the stubbornness." "Everyone notices the stubbornness," she said, and there was finally, genuinely, a smile. He finished the well casing on the 9th day. It took a full 2 days because the crack had propagated farther than it looked, and he had to reline the lower section completely, working in a narrow space with water at his boots and the smell of cold earth and old stone around him. Henry helped him, handing tools down when needed, taking the old mortar out in buckets, serious and focused and present. At one point, deep in the well with the light above him and the small sounds of the work echoing off the stone walls, Chester allowed himself to think about what staying would look like. Not in the abstract, in the specific. A Kansas winter was coming. The barn would not be adequate as a bedroom for the full cold of December. He would need to either build something or, and this was where his thinking stopped and restarted several times, there was the other possibility, the one that lived in the silence between him and Edith during the evenings on the porch, the one that existed in every straight, honest look she gave him, the one that made him feel like he was standing at the edge of something vast and solid and good. He was 40 feet down in a well thinking about this when Henry's voice came down from above. "Chester, someone coming." Chester climbed out of the well and dried his hands on his work trousers, and turned to see a man riding up the property road on a good bay horse. The man was perhaps 55, well dressed for this country, with the look of someone who made decisions about things other people had to live with. He had a younger man with him, early 30s maybe, riding a horse that cost real money. Edith was already on the porch when the men rode up. Her posture had changed. It was still straight, still composed, but there was a tension in it that Chester hadn't seen before, the tension of something specifically unwelcome arriving in a specific form. The older man got down from his horse and took off his hat, which was a courtesy gesture that did not appear to be backed by actual courtesy. "Edith," he said, "looking well." "Mr. Caulfield," she said. "Caulfield?" Chester filed the name. He had heard it from Metzger during his supply runs. Rutherford Caulfield, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county and whose family had been acquiring land in the area for 20 years, through purchase and through the particular kind of pressure that technically did not break any laws but that certainly had a point of view about who land ought to belong to. "I've come to renew my offer," Caulfield said. He had not looked at Chester yet, which was a deliberate choice. "The same terms as before. Fair market for the acreage, a generous allowance for your moving costs, and a new start somewhere easier for a woman in your situation." "My situation," Edith said. "Widow, 3 boys, failing homestead," Caulfield said with the clinical precision of a man who had rehearsed his arguments as weapons. "My homestead is not failing," Edith said. "My roof has been repaired, my well is being relined, my gate is fixed. My situation is my own business and my land is not for sale." Caulfield looked at Chester then. His assessment was quick and dismissive. "You hired help," he said to Edith. "I don't see how that's relevant to my declining your offer," Edith said. "It's relevant to how long the repairs hold before you need money for the next thing," Caulfield said, and there was an edge in it now, the edge of someone who was accustomed to patience yielding results and was beginning to feel impatient. "Edith, I have nothing but respect for what you've managed, but this land is better suited to a larger operation and you know it. Thomas knew it too." "Thomas knew nothing of the sort," Edith said, and her voice was flat and final as a closed door. Caulfield looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Chester again with a different quality of attention, the kind that was measuring whether Chester was a permanent factor or a temporary inconvenience. Chester met the look without expression. Caulfield put his hat back on. "My offer stands through the end of the month," he said. "After that, the terms change." "The terms will not be relevant after the end of the month or any other time," Edith said. Caulfield and the young man rode away. Edith stood on the porch until they were back on the main road, and then she sat down in the porch chair with the careful deliberateness of someone deciding to be still rather than to move, because moving would cost something she couldn't currently spare. Chester walked to the porch and leaned against the post and looked at her. "How long has he been making offers?" he said. "Since Thomas died," she said. "Before that, when Thomas was alive, he tried purchase first and then tried to claim our east fence line was 200 yards onto his property, which it was not. Thomas surveyed it himself twice. We have the papers." She looked at her hands. "Caulfield is not a villain in the storybook sense. He is simply a man who believes that money should accumulate toward itself, and that small claims should give way to larger ones, and that there is nothing wrong with this because the law generally agrees with him." "He doesn't have a legal claim," Chester said. "No," she said, "but pressure doesn't always need a legal claim. It just needs time and a target that's getting tired." Chester looked at her. "Are you getting tired?" She looked back at him with those honest brown eyes. "Some days," she said, and then, "less than I was." He went back to the well. The work on the well casing was finished by the end of that day. Chester spent the morning after testing it, drawing water up, checking the mortar, satisfied that it would hold through the winter and likely several winters after. He came out of the barn that evening and found all 3 boys sitting on the south porch in a row, waiting for him, which was unusual enough that he stopped and looked at them. "We want to talk to you," Henry said. Chester sat down on the porch step. "All right." Henry, apparently the designated speaker, sat very straight. "We know you're probably going to leave," he said. "Metzger told Mrs. Haverson and she told Mama and Caleb heard it." "What exactly did Metzger say?" Chester asked. "That you're a drifter and drifters don't stay," Caleb said. "And that you've been nicer to us than most, but that nice doesn't make someone stay," Henry added. And the bitterness in this was controlled but present, the bitterness of a 10-year-old who had already experienced the truth of this sentence. Will did not say anything. He was watching Chester with those enormous eyes, and holding the small carved horse that Chester had finished and painted gray with a mixture of Edith's white porch paint and a piece of charcoal ground down into powder. Chester looked at the 3 of them for a long moment. He thought about what he had said to Edith about being afraid to go. He thought about the cold panic that had always driven him out of places before the feeling of belonging could get its hooks in, and he recognized for the first time, sitting there in the Kansas evening with the 3 Shelton boys looking at him, that the cold panic had not come. It had not come when the attachment had grown. It had not come when the boys had started to need him. It had not come when Edith said his name in the rain. The thing he had been running from for 11 years had not arrived, and he did not know what that meant except that perhaps he had been running from something that was never going to catch up with him because it had never actually been chasing him, and the running itself had been the problem. "I'm going to talk to your mother," Chester said. Henry blinked. "About what?" "About whether she'd consider letting me stay permanent," Chester said. The silence on the porch was the kind that happens when 3 people simultaneously stop breathing in order to hear something properly. Caleb recovered first. "You mean like living here," he said. "If she'll have me," Chester said. "That's the important part, it's her decision." "What if she says no?" Caleb demanded. "Then I'll have to work harder at convincing her," Chester said. Caleb appeared to find this answer satisfying. He nodded seriously as though approving a business proposal. Henry said nothing, but something in the set of his jaw had changed. The deliberate tension he maintained there, the protection against another loss, had eased slightly, just slightly, but Chester noticed because he had been watching that jaw for days. Will held out the small gray horse toward Chester. Chester shook his head. "That's yours," he said. "I made it for you." Will pulled it back and held it against his chest with both hands, and Chester thought this might be the most significant thing that had happened to him in years. He found Edith in the kitchen. She was making bread, the physical work of it, the pressing and folding, with the focused quiet that meant she was thinking through something. She looked up when he came in and read his face immediately. "The boys talked to you," she said. It was not a question. "They did," he said. "I made them a promise. I wanted to make sure it was a promise I could keep before I made it, which means I need to talk to you." She stopped working the dough. She looked at him across the kitchen table, the bread between them, and something in her expression was very careful, very watchful, the way she looked when she was deciding how much of herself to commit to something. "What promise?" she said. "I told them I was going to ask you whether you'd consider me staying permanent," Chester said. "Not as a hired hand, as something with more intention than that." The kitchen was very quiet. The bread sat on the table. Somewhere outside, Caleb was shouting at something that was probably Henry. "Chester," she said. "I know the way this sounds," he said. "I know I've been here 11 days. I know you barely know me. I know you have 3 boys and a grief that isn't finished, and an anger that isn't finished, and a permanent stubbornness. I know all of that. I'm not asking you to make any decision right now. I'm asking whether the subject is one you're willing to think about." Edith looked at him for a long time. She had flour on her hands, and she was the most real and solid and actual person he had ever been in a room with, and the feeling in his chest had stopped being a frightening thing and had become simply true, the way the temperature is true or the direction of the wind is true. "I will think about it," she said finally. He nodded. "That's all I'm asking." He went back to the barn. He stayed for another 2 weeks without either of them addressing the question again directly, which was itself a kind of addressing. The work continued, because work on a 40-acre homestead never actually finished. He rebuilt the sagging section of the east porch. He winterized the chicken coop. He helped Henry and Caleb put up the last of the firewood that needed splitting for the cold months. And he discovered during this process that Caleb had a prodigious talent for swinging a maul that was going to be genuinely impressive in about 4 years when his arms had some more length on them. He and Edith talked in the evenings, on the porch or in the kitchen after the boys were in bed, with the ease of people who had found that they were comfortable in the same silence and equally comfortable breaking it. He told her things he had not told anyone in years. Not secrets, because he had no buried secrets, no hidden motive or dark betrayal in his past. Just the plain facts of his history, his family in Missouri, His father who was a quiet man and his mother who was not. His years of moving from one temporary thing to another. His years of feeling like he was waiting for something to be enough without knowing what enough felt like. She told him about Thomas. Not as a sacred thing that must not be touched, but as the complicated truth of a real marriage between two real people. Thomas had been kind and she had loved him, and she had also spent 7 years quietly carrying his tendency toward optimism past the point of evidence, his certainty that next year would be the year everything turned around, his resistance to asking for help that had made the last winter harder than it should have been. She said these things without cruelty and with love, and with the kind of honesty that only becomes possible once the first sharpness of grief has passed through, and what's left is the full human shape of the person who is gone. Chester listened to all of it. He listened well, which was not something he had known about himself until Edith began talking to him in ways that deserved good listening. It was in the 3rd week that Caulfield came back. He came not to Edith this time, but to Chester. He caught Chester alone at the general store in Haverford Crossing and offered him $50 to encourage Edith to accept the sale and move on. Chester looked at the money and then at Caulfield and felt a clean, uncomplicated anger move through him that had the virtue of total simplicity. "No," he said. "$75, Caulfield said. "I said no," Chester said. "Mr. Rhodes." Caulfield's voice shifted, the smooth courtesy going thinner. "You're a drifter, a man without property or stake. You have nothing to gain from this woman holding onto land she can't properly work. You'll be gone by spring." Chester thought about Will's hand on his arm 2 nights ago, the first time the boy had reached for him, small fingers gripping the sleeve of his shirt while Chester read to him from the almanac, which was the only book Edith owned besides the Bible, and which Will had decided contained important information that needed reading aloud nightly. He thought about Henry teaching himself the roof repair logic and presenting Chester with a correctly identified structural problem that morning with barely suppressed pride. He thought about Caleb's laugh. He thought about Edith in the lamplight with her hair down, holding the lantern up in the rain so he could see. "I won't be gone by spring," Chester said, "and I'd suggest you leave her alone, because she's got the survey papers on the east fence line, and she's got more patience for a fight than you're accounting for." Caulfield looked at him with the cold calculation of someone revising their assessment. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I've made plenty," Chester said. "This isn't one of them." He told Edith that evening. He told her precisely and completely, including the amounts offered, because she deserved to know all of it, and he was not going to be a man who decided what information she could handle. She listened with that still, focused attention of hers. Then she said, "He tried to buy Thomas off once too. Thomas refused and didn't tell me about it for a month because he didn't want me to worry. I found out anyway, and I was angrier about the secrecy than about Caulfield." "I know," Chester said. "That's why I told you." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp was burning low and the October wind was working at the windows and the house was quiet with the specific quality of quiet that belongs to sleeping children. "Chester," she said. "Yes," he said. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the question you asked." He waited. "I think," she said carefully, choosing each word, "that you are a good man. I think you've been a good man all along and haven't had a good enough reason to stay still long enough to find that out for yourself. I think my boys would be fortunate to have you around, and I think I might be fortunate to have you around, and I think I'm frightened of that because the last time I counted on someone being around, I couldn't." "I understand that," Chester said. "Do you?" she said. "Really?" "Yes," he said. "The last time I counted on something feeling like enough, it didn't. So we're both scared. I think that's probably normal." She looked at him, and then something in her face changed. Something that had been held very carefully for a very long time released slightly, like a door being opened from the inside. "I'd like to think about it differently," she said. "Not as a choice about whether I'm willing to risk it, but as a choice about whether I'm willing to trust what I'm observing about you, which is the same thing I use for every other decision I make. evidence and observation. "And what do you observe?" he asked. "A man who fixed my roof in the rain at 2 in the morning," she said. "A man who taught my oldest boy about fixing the real problem instead of the symptom. A man who carved a horse for my youngest and let him keep it. A man who turned down $75 and told me about it immediately." She paused. "A man who is afraid to leave instead of afraid to stay. I observe all of that." Chester's voice was not entirely steady when he said, "And what does the evidence suggest?" "That you should stay," she said simply. "That we should see what this becomes." He reached across the table and she let him take her hand, and they sat like that in the kitchen with the wind outside and the lamp burning down, and Chester felt the last 11 years of restless motion finally come to rest, like a compass needle finding north. That was not yet the whole story, of course. Real things take time and real things have complications because they are made of real people. They were careful with it through November. They did not rush. They allowed themselves to be in each other's company without putting a name on it yet, which was the right pace for two people who were both, for different reasons, cautious about what names could do. The boys watched with varying degrees of subtlety, Caleb with no subtlety whatsoever and Henry with the careful lateral watching of someone who was trying not to let himself hope too obviously, and Will with the simple attentiveness of a child who understood that something important was happening and was determined not to miss it. Chester built himself a proper sleeping room in the barn. Not because he was being sent to the barn, but because he was a man of some principles, and this was one of them. He built it from the same lumber he'd used for the roof repairs, framed it properly, installed a small iron stove that he bought in Caldwell when he rode there to sell some fence repair work he picked up for a neighbor, and the small square room became his with the specificity of a place that a person has made rather than simply occupied. He courted her properly. He thought about this word, courted, and it felt old-fashioned and completely right. He brought her a book from Caldwell, a collection of poetry that he bought because he remembered she had mentioned once that she used to read poetry before the demands of the farm had narrowed her reading to the almanac and whatever the boys needed. He brought it without comment and set it on the table, and she picked it up and looked at him over it with an expression that was soft in a way she didn't often allow herself to be. He asked her to walk with him in the evenings when the weather permitted, which it did less and less as November deepened toward December. She walked with him along the property line, both of them in coats, their breath visible in the cold air, and they talked about everything. About Kansas and Missouri and the shape of the country, about what she wanted for the boys and what she had wanted for herself before wanting became a luxury, about what he had been looking for in all those years of motion, and whether he thought he'd found something like it here. One evening in late November, walking along the north fence line with the first snow of the season coming in soft and early, he stopped walking and she stopped walking and he said, "I love you." I want to say it plainly because I'm not a man who finds it easy to say plainly, and I want to try. Edith stood in the new snow and looked at him, and her eyes were very bright. "I love you too," she said. "That has also not been easy to say, and I want credit for saying it." He laughed. The laugh surprised him, the way it came from somewhere deep and unguarded, and she smiled at the laugh, and he kissed her for the first time standing in the first snow of 1883, which was the year, he thought, that he stopped running. December was hard in the way Kansas Decembers were hard. The cold came in through every gap, and the wood had to be managed carefully, and the animals needed constant attention, and the boys had school in town 3 days a week, which meant 3 days a week of getting 3 boys into boots and coats, and onto the wagon and the 2 miles to the schoolhouse and back. Chester did this without being asked, because Edith had enough to manage with the indoor work and the animals in the cold, and the boys, even Henry, had stopped minding his presence on those wagon trips and had begun, in fact, to use them for conversation. Henry talked to him about his father on one of those wagon trips. Talked about him the way a boy talks about a father when the grief has moved from sharp to specific, the individual memories rather than the general loss. He told Chester about Thomas teaching him to fish in the creek east of the property, about his father's habit of whistling the same 3 notes over and over when he was thinking, about how Thomas had started teaching him checkers and they had been in the middle of a long-running game when he got sick and Henry had never finished the game. The board was still set up in the parlor exactly where they'd left it. Chester said, "We could start a new game." Henry said, "I don't think I want to yet." "That's all right," Chester said. "When you're ready." 3 months later, Henry would ask Chester to play checkers. Chester remembered this promise and played 3 games and lost all 3, which was not deliberate. Henry was genuinely sharp at the game. Christmas arrived and with it a letter from Chester's brother in Missouri, responding to a letter Chester had written in November, the first letter he'd written home in 4 years. His brother, Robert, wrote back with the mix of relief and mild accusation that comes from people who have been worried for a long time, and told Chester that their mother was well and their sister had married a farmer in Independence. Chester read the letter twice and felt the specific warmth of reconnected threads, things he had let go slack in the years of motion that could apparently be pulled taut again. He showed the letter to Edith, because showing things to Edith had become his natural response to anything significant that arrived in his life. "You should write to your mother," she said. "I know," he said. "Today," she said. He wrote to his mother that day. Christmas itself was the best day Chester had spent in years, which surprised him because he was not a sentimental man about holidays. But there was something about the specific combination of the small house and the smell of Edith's cooking and the boys' noise and the particular light of a December morning in Kansas that came together into something he understood to be the thing he had been riding away from for 11 years, without knowing what he was riding away from. Caleb got a pocket knife, which he had campaigned for with unrelenting energy since October, and which Edith had agreed to on the condition that Chester teach him proper handling, which Chester did with military thoroughness, and Caleb received with complete seriousness. Henry got a new compass, which he carried with the reverence of someone who understood what it was for. Will got a set of wooden animals that Chester had spent 3 weeks carving in the evenings, 6 pieces, a horse, a cow, a dog, a bear, a rabbit, and something that had started as a buffalo and had ended up looking more like a very muscular rabbit, but which will declare to be a buffalo with complete certainty, and Chester supported this interpretation. Edith opened her gift last. It was a small brooch, silver, that Chester had bought from a traveling goods merchant who passed through in November. A simple thing, a flower, not expensive, but he had seen her looking at it when the merchant displayed his goods on the general store counter, and she had looked away from it the particular way that people look away from things they want but will not allow themselves. She looked at the brooch for a long moment. Then she looked at Chester with the full directness of her, no distance in it at all, and said, "Thank you," which was all she said, but it was the specific way she said it. January and February were deep winter, and the work of surviving a Kansas winter on a working homestead was serious and unromantic and endless. And Chester was present for all of it, from the 3 in the morning wake-up when one of the cows was having trouble with a calf, which came out breech and alive, and which Caleb promptly named Chester Jr. to universal amusement, to the frozen pump handle that needed daily negotiating, to the long evenings of mending and reading, and the domestic rhythm of people who have decided to share the same life. Edith came to him one February evening after the boys were in bed and sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "I want to talk about what happens next." Chester looked at her. "What do you want to happen next?" "I want to marry you," she said with her characteristic directness, and then something softer. "If you're willing, if you're ready. I'm not asking you to decide tonight." "I've been ready for 3 months," Chester said. "I was waiting for you," she smiled. It was the full smile, the one that didn't hold anything back. He had been cataloging her smiles since October, and this one was the best version of it. "March," she said, "after the planting preparation. There's too much to do in February." "March," he agreed. He proposed properly the following evening, on one knee on the kitchen floor with the lamp light and the smell of bread and the sound of Will talking to himself in the bedroom upstairs. And she looked down at him and said yes with the composed certainty of someone who has thought this through completely and found the evidence fully sufficient. The ring was simple, a gold band purchased in Caldwell during a supply run, and it fit because he had measured her finger while she was sleeping one evening when her hand was resting on the table, which she found out about later and pronounced sneaky, which he accepted. They told the boys the next morning. Caleb reacted as though this had been his plan all along and began immediately discussing the changes this would create in the sleeping arrangements, specifically whether he and Henry could have the larger room. Henry sat very still for a moment, and Chester watched his face carefully, and what he saw there was not resistance but something more complicated and more careful, the face of a boy trying to decide whether he was allowed to want this. Chester said, "Henry." "What are you thinking?" Henry looked at him. "Are you going to be our father?" he said. The kitchen was quiet. Will was watching from behind his carved buffalo. Chester said, "I'm not going to be your father. Thomas was your father and he always will be. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be the man who's here. The man who teaches you things and comes to get you when you're in trouble and sits at the table with you and helps your mother. I'd like to be that." He paused. "You can call me Chester or you can call me whatever you want to call me. That part is your choice." Henry thought about this for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." It was the same kind of okay that meant everything, and they both knew it. The wedding was in March, at the church in Haverford Crossing, presided over by Reverend Aldrich, who was a small, energetic man with a great deal of enthusiasm for the institution of marriage and the union of people who clearly needed each other. Half the county was there, which in this county was about 60 people, plus Metzger, who stood in the back with his hands clasped in front of him, and wore an expression of complete satisfaction that suggested he had known all along exactly how things would go. Edith wore a dress she had made herself from fabric ordered by mail from Kansas City, a blue-gray wool that was not a wedding dress in the formal sense, but was the best thing she owned and was beautiful on her, and she walked down the aisle of that small church with the same self-possession she brought to everything, steady and unhurried and present. And Chester stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him and felt the thing in his chest that had started with a mason jar of pennies and a boy standing barefoot in the mud complete itself into something whole and certain. The vows were the traditional ones. Chester said them clearly. Edith said them looking directly at him the whole time, which was entirely in keeping with who she was. And when the Reverend pronounced them married and Chester kissed her, the children in attendance made various sounds of amusement, and Will, from his position next to Henry in the front pew, said very quietly, "Good." The reception was at the homestead, with food brought by half the county and a fiddle player from Caldwell who had come up with Metzger, and who played through the evening, while people danced on the flat ground between the barn and the house. And Chester danced with Edith twice, and then with each of the boys once. The dancing with Caleb being energetic to the point of structural concern, and the dancing with Henry being self-conscious and dignified, and the dancing with Will being conducted at a very slow pace while Will stood on Chester's boots, which Will declared was the correct method. That evening, after the guests had gone and the boys were in bed and the property was quiet under the big Kansas sky, Chester and Edith sat on the south porch together in the cold, his arm around her and her head against his shoulder, and looked out at the land that was theirs now, the 40 acres and the repaired house and the good well and the pasture and the barn with the small room in it that Chester no longer needed. "It's a good piece of land," he said. "It is," she said. "Thomas picked it well." "We'll do well by it," Chester said. "I know," she said, simply, certainly. The spring came, and with it the planting, and Chester farmed for the first time in his life with the full investment of a man farming his own land, or land that was at least partly his in the way that a shared life makes things shared. Henry worked beside him as an equal partner in a way that was remarkable for a 10-year-old, and that Chester thought about when he thought about who this boy was going to become. Caleb was useful in the passionate and unpredictable way that 7-year-olds are useful on a farm, enormously energetic in short bursts with occasional catastrophic distractions. Will followed at his 8-foot distance, which had shrunk by spring to approximately 2 feet, which was progress of the most gratifying kind. Caulfield made one more approach in April. He came himself, without the young man this time, and asked to speak to Chester alone. Chester told him there was nothing he could say to Chester alone that couldn't be said in front of Edith, and Edith came out of the house and stood on the porch with her arms at her sides and her chin level and her brown eyes direct, and Caulfield looked at the two of them standing together on the porch of the repaired house and made some internal calculation. "You've decided to stay," he said to Chester. "Permanently," Chester said. Caulfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Edith, "Your husband made it clear to me that your survey papers are correct and that my claims on the east fence line are without merit." This was not an apology. It was not quite an admission, but it was as close as a man like Caulfield got to either. "I know they are," Edith said. Caulfield nodded once, put his hat back on, and rode away. Chester watched him go and then looked at Edith. "That's the last of it," she said. "I think so," Chester said. She went back inside, and Chester stayed on the porch for a moment looking at the spring fields, green with the beginning of the new season, and thought about Thomas Shelton, who had built this house to last and had been right about that, and felt a complicated, honest gratitude toward a man he had never met. The summer was good. The crop was good, better than the previous year because there were 2 capable adults managing it instead of 1 capable adult and a 10-year-old. And there was enough water and enough sun. And by August the corn was tall and the garden was full, and the root cellar was filling with the winter's supply of preserved things. And Edith stood in the kitchen on an August afternoon and looked around at the shelves of canned vegetables and preserved fruits and the hanging herbs and the general abundance of it, and said, with the quiet certainty of someone reporting a fact, "We're going to be all right." "We are," Chester said. Henry turned 11 in July, and Chester gave him a good folding knife and a book on surveying and land measurement that Henry received with the speechless intensity of someone receiving exactly the right thing. And Chester thought about the boy in 20 years and thought that whoever he became would be remarkable. Caleb turned 8 in September and celebrated by climbing to the top of the barn roof, which Chester discovered by looking out the kitchen window, and the negotiation that followed regarding appropriate birthday behavior was conducted with both parties maintaining their dignity. Will turned 5 in October and said at his birthday supper surrounded by family and cake, "Chester is my almost father," and then looked at Chester to see if this formulation was acceptable. Chester said, "Almost father is exactly right." Will appeared satisfied with this. In November, Edith told Chester she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen, as she told him most things, directly and without preamble. She had that careful, watchful expression that meant she was reading his response closely, because this was information with the potential to change things in ways neither of them could fully predict. Chester sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a moment and felt something enormous and inarticulate move through him. Then he looked up at her. "Are you well?" he said first, because that was the first thing. "I am well," she said. "Are you frightened?" "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "And also the other thing." "Happy," she said. "Very," he said. She sat down across from him, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table where so much of their life had happened, and he reached across, and she took his hand, and they held on. The boys were told that evening. The responses were characteristic. Caleb asked immediately and practically whether the baby would be sleeping in his room. Henry asked whether it would be a boy or a girl with the tone of someone gathering data, and Will considered the information carefully and then said, "Can I hold it?" Which Edith said yes to, and Chester said he could teach Will to do that properly, and Will said, "Chester will show me," with such total confidence that Chester had to look away for a moment at the window and the November dark outside it. Chester wrote to his mother that week with the news, and his mother's letter back was warm with a warmth he hadn't felt from that direction in years, and she said she hoped to come to Kansas in the spring to meet her daughter-in-law and grandsons. And Chester read this letter to Edith, and Edith said she would write to his mother herself, and she did. And his mother's next letter mentioned Edith, specifically in terms that made clear the two women had already found each other with the direct accuracy of people who recognized quality. The winter was easier than the previous one, both materially, because the root cellar was full and the firewood was abundant, and Chester had spent November winterizing the house more thoroughly than it had ever been winterized, and emotionally, because the household was a different thing than it had been a year ago, warmer in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. Henry taught himself checkers properly over the winter, working from a book Chester ordered for him from a printer in Wichita, and challenged Chester to a game in February, the game they'd discussed that October in the wagon. Chester lost 2 out of 3 with honest effort, and the third game he won on the last move, and Henry's expression suggested he was already identifying what he'd done wrong. Caleb developed an obsession with astronomy over the winter, sparked by Chester's offhand comment about navigation by stars on cattle drives, and began appearing at Chester's elbow in the evenings with questions about constellations that quickly exceeded Chester's knowledge and required a trip to the library at the school in Caldwell to get the right books. Will, who was now 5 and in full possession of language, talked to Chester with the continuous, free-associating confidence of a child who has fully decided that the person they're talking to is safe to think out loud around, and Chester listened to all of it, the small observations and the large questions, and the reports on the behavior of the wooden animals, because listening to Will was one of the genuine pleasures of his life. Edith grew large with the pregnancy and uncomfortable with it, and managed the discomfort with characteristic practicality. Chester did more of the outside work during the coldest months, and she directed operations from inside with the full command of someone who has decided that discomfort is not an excuse for inefficiency. And the household ran, and the animals were fed, and the accounts were kept, and the boys were raised. The baby arrived in June of 1884, which was a good month for it, warm enough and not yet into the full heat, with the window open and a breeze coming through, and Mrs. Haverson there to assist, which she did with the experienced calm of a woman who had attended many births and viewed each one as further evidence of the general stubbornness and competence of the human body. It was a boy. Chester was outside with the 3 boys when he was called in, and he came into the bedroom where Edith was sitting up with the extraordinary exhausted brightness of someone who has done an enormous thing and knows it, holding a very small person wrapped in a blanket, and she looked up at Chester and said, "Come meet your son." Chester sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy, and the boy looked back at him with the unfocused, ancient gaze of a newborn, and Chester felt something happen to him that was beyond description, a rearrangement at a level below thought. "His name," Chester said and stopped. "I'd like to name him James," Edith said, "after Thomas's father." "Is that all right?" "James is a good name," Chester said. "James Chester Shelton Rhodes," Edith said. "I want him to have both." Chester looked at her. "All of us are a both," she said simply. "That's not a problem, that's just true." He kissed her forehead and she leaned into him, and the baby made a small sound that was approximately an opinion about something. And Chester Rhodes sat in the June light with his wife and his son, and the sounds of 3 boys barely contained outside the window, and thought about a mason jar with 3 pennies in it and a boy standing barefoot in the mud, and how the simplest thing in the world had been the thing that finally broke 11 years of careful, purposeless motion. The boys came in one at a time. Caleb first, And Caleb looked at the baby with wide eyes and reached out one finger and touched the baby's hand, and James Chester wrapped his tiny fingers around Caleb's finger with that reflex that newborns have, and Caleb looked up at Chester and Edith with an expression of total wonder that stripped away all the bluster and energy and revealed the boy underneath, still young, still open to being amazed. Henry came next and stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the baby for a long time with his careful, thinking face, and then he said, "He has your eyes," to Edith, and she said, "He has Chester's nose," and Henry looked at Chester's nose and at the baby's nose and appeared to accept this assessment. Will came last with his carved buffalo under his arm, and he stood next to Chester and looked at the baby with total seriousness and then looked up at Chester. "Is he ours?" Will said. "He is ours," Chester said. Will reached up and took Chester's hand, which he had never done before, just took it with his small, warm grip, and stood holding it while he looked at his new baby brother with the steady, absorbing attention he brought to everything important. Chester held his son's hand and his youngest boy's hand and felt the full, complete, inarguable truth of the life he was in. The summer passed in the fullness of itself, with the new baby and the growing boys and the good crop that required all of them in their different capacities, and the evenings that were long and warm and full of the specific noise and life that a full household makes, a sound that Chester had not known he was missing for 11 years, because he had not known this sound existed. He wrote to his mother in August and told her to come in October if she was able, and she wrote back and said she would come, and she arrived on the 3rd of October on the stage from Caldwell, a small fierce woman of 60, with the clear eyes that Chester had inherited, and a manner that Edith recognized within the first 10 minutes as being in the family of her own, which created between them an immediate, practical, mutual respect that Chester observed with relief and amusement. His mother held James Chester and said nothing for a long time. Then she said to Chester, "You took long enough." "I know," he said, "but you got here," she said. "I did," he said. She stayed 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks she and Edith reached an understanding that was rooted in the recognizing of two women who were fundamentally alike in certain important ways: the directness, the practicality, the refusal to soften necessary truths. And Chester stood in the kitchen one evening listening to them talking at the table, and thought that whatever deficit of connection had been running in the background of his life for 11 years was running no longer. The autumn of 1884 was everything it should have been. The harvest was good, and they had enough for the winter, and enough to put some aside, and Chester made careful note of this as a fact that would be true again next year and the year after, because the land was good, and they were working it right. The roof was solid, the well was clean, the porch was level on all 4 posts, the gate on the north pasture had not failed since Chester fixed it a year ago and would not fail again. Henry turned 12 and was already the best student in his class at the Haverford Crossing School, and his teacher, a serious young woman from Ohio named Miss Birch, sent home a note saying that Henry showed exceptional promise in mathematics and science and might consider further education in Wichita or Kansas City when he was old enough. Chester read the note and looked at Edith, and Edith looked at Chester, and they both understood that this was going to be a conversation they would have in 4 or 5 years, and that it would be complicated, and that they would work through it together, because that was what they did. Caleb turned 9 and continued his undefeated campaign of energy against the general order of the household and the farm, and Chester thought more than once that in 15 years Caleb was going to be exactly the kind of man the West needed, full of motion and nerve and good humor and absolutely certain of himself, and that the knife and the roofing skills and the astronomy books were all part of who he would become. Will turned 6 and started school and was quiet there in the way he was quiet everywhere, absorbing everything and saying very little but saying things, when he said them, that made his teacher stop what she was doing and think. On his first day of school, Will put his carved horse in his coat pocket and patted it once before he went in, which Chester saw from the wagon and which he thought about for the rest of the day with a warmth that sat in his chest like a good fire. James Chester grew and grew, and was an excellent baby with the serious gaze of a person who is taking very careful notes. And Chester held him in the evenings in the porch chair, and looked out at the property, and felt the pure, uncomplicated fact of where he was and who he was, which was a man who had come to the right place at the right time, and had had the sense to recognize it and stay. One evening in November, exactly 1 year after Edith had told him she was pregnant, Chester was sitting on the south porch in the late light with James Chester asleep in the crook of his arm, and Edith came out and sat beside him, and the boys were inside doing their evening things, and the farm was settling into the quiet of a late autumn day, and Edith put her head on Chester's shoulder and looked out at the fields. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That I'm glad Metzger sent me," Chester said. She laughed, which was the full laugh, the one that gave everything. "You still think he sent you?" "He absolutely sent me," Chester said. "He had that look." "He had a look because your horse threw a shoe," she said. "He had a look because he's Metzger," Chester said. She was quiet for a moment. "Chester." "Yes. I want to tell you something." He waited. "Last October," she said, "when the roof was leaking and I was so tired I could barely stand up in the evenings, and I didn't have enough money for the lumber, and the boys were trying so hard, and I felt like the whole thing was going to come apart, I prayed. I don't pray very often because I think prayer mostly requires you to ask for what you need, and I find that very difficult. But I prayed, and I asked for help." Chester was quiet. "And then Metzger found you," she said. "Or you found Metzger. Or your horse threw a shoe. I don't know how to explain it except that I asked and then you were there, and you were exactly the right kind of help, not the kind that makes you feel small for needing it, but the kind that makes you feel able." Chester looked down at his sleeping son. He looked out at the land. He thought about 11 years of motion and 1 mason jar of pennies and a 7-year-old boy with a split lip who did not cry. "I don't know much about how those things work," Chester said. "But I know I was in the right place, and I know I had enough sense to stay." She reached up and took his face in her hands and turned him toward her and kissed him in the November evening with the baby asleep between them and the light fading over the Kansas fields. And Chester felt every mile of those 11 years settle into the earth under his feet, not lost, not wasted, just walked, and at their end this. The years went on. This is the nature of years, to continue, to build on each other, to accumulate the specific weight of good living. Chester Rhodes became a permanent and fully present feature of the landscape of Haverford Crossing, a man known for his work and his word and his quiet, which was not the quiet of a man with nothing to say, but the quiet of a man who had decided what mattered and gave his attention to that. He was known as Edith Shelton's husband, and the Shelton boys' stepfather, and a reliable hand at a neighbor's need, and a man who would speak plainly when something needed to be said, and otherwise kept his own counsel. Henry went to study in Wichita at 17, paid for by 3 years of savings, and a small scholarship from the county school board that Miss Birch had championed with characteristic dedication, and he came back on holidays and summers and looked different each time, more himself rather than less, which was the best thing that could happen to a person. And he wrote long letters home that Chester and Edith read in the evenings, and that will read carefully and separately, and that Caleb read aloud to make them funnier, which Henry pretended to object to, and did not actually object to. Caleb grew into exactly the man Chester had predicted, all nerve and motion, and the good humor of someone who has always been certain that life would be interesting. And at 18, he was already running the north section of the farm with a capability that freed Chester for other work. And he had the beginning of a friendship with a girl named Pearl Haverson, Mrs. Haverson's niece, who had arrived from Illinois, and who was as energetic and direct as Caleb, and who regarded him with the speculative interest of someone who has identified something worth investigating. Willett 12 was tall and quiet and brilliant in the particular way that quiet people are brilliant, not showing it, just applying it, and his teacher in Haverford Crossing had written 3 letters about him with increasing urgency about higher education, which Chester and Edith were putting aside money for with the same patient determination they brought to everything. James Chester, at 4, was walking and running and climbing and talking, and being an absolute force of nature in a small body, with Chester's hair and Edith's eyes, and the stubbornness that apparently ran in this family like a river, broad and unstoppable and occasionally floods. On a September evening in 1888, Chester stood on the south porch of the house that Thomas Shelton had built to last, and that Chester had repaired and maintained, and added to in the 5 years since he'd arrived. And he looked out at 40 acres of good Kansas farmland, and a well that didn't leak, and a roof that didn't leak, and a gate that swung true on its hinges. And he heard behind him the sounds of the household. Edith's voice, James Chester's laugh, while practicing his letters aloud in the particular way he had of saying each word as he wrote it, Caleb's heavy step on the floorboards, the general productive noise of 5 people in a house that was full in the right way. He thought about a man on a horse, 11 years of road, nowhere to be. He thought about a boy with a mason jar. He thought about taking off his hat. He turned and went inside into the warm and lit house, into the life that had changed him so completely that the man he had been before it felt like a sketch, partial and preliminary, waiting for the full painting to arrive. "Chester," Edith said from the kitchen, not looking up from what she was doing. "Supper in 10 minutes." "I'm here," Chester said. He was